This is a video tour of my experimental Sonex aircraft focusing on the custom modifications I made during construction. It is scratch-built from plans and was begun in 2009, finishing in 2014. It's powered by an AeroV VW engine putting out 80 horsepower. It's been flying now for 5 years and 360 flight hours, and it's flown from Boston to AirVenture twice. And as you can see, it likes to get upside down too. Although custom modifications invariably add more construction time, what home builder can resist making changes to suit their own liking? I'll start at the tail and work forward. For the tail tips on the vertical and on the horizontal, the standard Sonex detail is to take this fiberglass, put it underneath the metal, and then rivet it. But what I and a lot of other people did that gets a much nicer joint here and much less complicated when it goes around the leading edge here is to create an extra rib that basically faces this way, and that gets fastened to the end rib here in the horizontal, and then we go ahead and rivet to that extra rib that we've created, and you get a much nicer seam. If you need to take anything off in the future, you're drilling out this. If you damage the fiberglass, it's much easier to take off that extra rib, make a new one, put this on, put it back on, and get a good fit. So this tail fairing on the right side of the aircraft is removable on the plans so that you can get inside and check the tail assembly when you're doing your annual condition inspection. The plans, though, have these just as sheet metal screws, and I didn't like the idea of sheet metal screws because over time those holes kind of get stripped or wallowed. Now you have to go to a larger screw and a larger screw, and it just gets worse over time. So what I decided to do instead was use a nut plate, and in the tail surface here I set the nut plate with the two rivets. Nut plate, nut plate, nut plate. Same thing in the horizontal tail here, or the vertical tail, and then I just go ahead and use a machine screw into the nut plate. And if the nut plate ever does strip, then all I have to do is drill out the rivet and then put in a new nut plate, and I'm not disturbing the rest of the metal of the aircraft. So here on my horizontal trim tab, I decided to use a B nut here instead of having a little Z bend in the end of this cable. And that allows me to better adjust this because I can loosen up the B nut here and slide this cable in and out here, so I can make an adjustment back here, not just up in the cockpit. And again, it doesn't wallow out this very thin aluminum piece here because this is very rigidly attached, and all of this pivots in here. So anytime I have an inspection hole and need an inspection cover, I got this little trick from Glenn Hunt, and that was to go ahead and put a clear plexi instead, and that way I can look inside to the things I need to look at without even having to take the plate off. So during my annual condition inspection, I do take everything off anyway, because I need to check everything inside. But just on a visual check, on a walk around, something like that, it's nice to be able to just look inside and see that everything's okay. So what you may not be able to see too well back there, but in the fuselage, in the last several bays on both sides, I have that diagonal that goes from the upper left there to the lower right that's behind the cable there, and that's just an L-shaped bent piece of 025 or 032, I forget which, and it's got double-sided 3M VHB tape on it, and that's there to keep the fuselage side from oil canning. So if you've ever been on a Sonex that does not have something like this on there and you're taxiing, and sometimes when you're going fast in the air, you really hear the skin of the aircraft rattling. It makes quite a noise, and that's just because all that skin is moving. So by putting those angles on there, on the last 3 or 4 bays on both sides, that is enough to stiffen the metal so that it doesn't have all that banging and oil canning, and it's worked tremendously well. One thing I did find was I originally stuck it on with double-sided carpet tape way back when I still had the floor of the aircraft removed for assembly. And I don't know, several months after I had put those on, I came there one time to my basement and found those angles, or a couple of them, sitting on the floor. The tape had come loose and dropped on the floor. And that would have been a really bad thing if those angles had come off, in flight and gotten, jammed somewhere. So the 3M VHB stands for very high bond. That tape is really strong. You almost have to use a blowtorch to get it off. So the second time I went and put those angles on using the VHB, and they're solid as heck, and I've never had to change anything, never had to fix anything. They've been on there for the last 7 years or so. I put my comm antenna on top of the fuselage instead of under. You put it under, especially in a tail dragger, and that antenna is awfully close to the ground. If you're landing on a grass strip, you really are going to be dragging that thing in the ground. And I have never, ever, ever found that having the antenna on top of the fuselage cuts down on how well your radio works in the air or on the ground. So I would strongly recommend you put it on top of the aircraft instead of the bottom of the aircraft. So if you can see there, I have a cover that goes over the push rod that goes back to the elevator. And it's because I throw things down there for traveling. Didn't want anything interfering with that. So it's held down with Velcro. It's kind of a U shape with a couple of flares on either side. Got Velcro on there to hold it down so it's easy to take off and inspect or move around. So there's another angle of it. Now, I happen to really like the visual sight gauge. You can see two sets of marks on there. Since I have a tail dragger, the red marks are the amount of fuel when I'm sitting on the ground, and the blue marks are how much fuel I have in there when I'm in level flight in the air. Blue for sky is how I remember that. And I just find that's the absolute foolproof way to know how much fuel you've got. And there's no problem with, if there's ever a leak in the tube or it cracks or anything like that, not very much fuel is going to come out, because if you follow the Sonex instructions, then in that fitting right there where it goes into the fuel tank, you take the end of the fitting and you solder it fully closed, and then you just drill a very tiny hole in it, and that's enough to let the liquid in, the fuel, and to keep it displaying properly in the fuel tube. I happen to really, really like the stock trim lever instead of the dial trim. It's infinitely adjustable. Back, forward. It's right there. You always know where it's at. You know where neutral is. You know where nose down is. It's just dirt simple, and there's, in my opinion, no reason whatsoever why you need something like a dial trim. Up in the air, you just take this and touch it, touch it, touch it, touch it, wherever you need to do it. Infinitely adjustable. So this is my fuel shutoff valve, and that's the rod right here. And when it's all the way out, you can see here it says pull off, and that's the fuel. So when it's out, I know the fuel's off. When I push it all the way in, it's connected down here to the valve with a little offset that I made here out of aluminum, so that the rod is way out here and the valve's over here, because that valve handle always goes in the direction of the valve when it's open. So I just have a ball-end joint right there. That's on with a fastener. That comes up through the instrument panel, and that's how I do the fuel. So when it's all the way forward, that's fuel on. Out, fuel off. Instantly know by just looking at it. And something I didn't do right away, but I put a little plastic grommet in the panel there for that to slide in. I didn't do that at first, and this was wearing away at the metal of the panel, starting to elongate the hole, so this way it should last forever. So the center section of my panel is completely removable. So from this point here to this point here, this all comes out as one piece. The right side, the left side are always fixed. And that's pretty important, because if you've ever tried to do any work underneath the Sonex panel, there is not a lot of room under there to work. And you really have to get upside down, get past the seat, get upside down, and it's just not fun at all. And you do have to get back there for things. You need to check things in your annual condition inspection. Sometimes you might have or checking for a loose connection, any number of things back there. So what I did is I put the piano hinge across the top here, piano hinge across the bottom here. Then I have one hinge pin that goes from here to here, one hinge pin that goes from here to here, and the same thing up top, hinge pin, hinge pin. So all I have to do is pull this hinge pin out, this one out, that one out, that one out, and then because of I have my fuel shutoff going through, I take this out as well, but this is just screwed on with some threads at the other end, which is part of what you'll see elsewhere in this video. So all I do is just unscrew this 10 turns, and this rod comes right out. Once that's out, I can just take this whole panel out, and I can get to all my switches. I can get to the radios and the switches on this side. I can get to the radio and the switches on this side, and then I can get to everything in the middle and all the wiring behind there. I honestly consider this an absolute must. You must have a removable panel. It's just absurd to have a fixed panel and to try to work on your aircraft. So, and this is something that you can potentially do after the fact, but it would certainly be a lot easier if you did this while you were building. So, highly recommended. Make the whole center section removable. Note that Sonex does say that this entire panel is part of the structural system across the fuselage. So, I do have this with continuous hinge pins, top and bottom. I didn't just put a couple of fasteners in here. I wanted something that was much more rigid and much more continuous from one side to the other. These are combination breakers and switches. So I switch all my stuff on and off. If one of them trips, this lights up, and I can reset it by pushing it up and then back down. And if it trips again, then you go ahead and leave it off, like you do for any other breaker. But that saves some space, and then I'll have to figure out some place on the side of the fuselage or somewhere else to put fuses. So you do have to size these for whatever load you need. So some of these are 5 amps, some are 10 amps, some are different amps. So I have an MGL V6 comm radio here, and it's got a flip-flop button there. Go between stations. Volume is right there. Frequencies, it changes the frequency on the bottom, and once you've got it changed, you can flip-flop to there. I get a nice strong signal, both receiving and transmitting, just as far as any certificated aircraft radio that I've ever used. So I've been pretty happy with this. It's a good radio. I'd recommend it. This is my Sandia STX 165 transponder. Also a good piece of hardware. I'd recommend it. There's two versions of this. There's this that has the entire body of the radio behind it, but there's also one where it just has this head, and then you can take the actual radio assembly and remote it somewhere else in the aircraft, and then just wire from there to the head. So if you're tight for space behind your panel, you can do that. I find switching the numbers on this to be a little bit time consuming. Not as easy as having some of the old transponders where the numbers are right here and just change, and they're all changed. Instead, what you have to do is you have to press this, and then once that happens, you can see that number blinking, and then you change numbers. When you're done, you take this inside ring, you turn that, once, it goes back and forth, and it changes to that number. Now you can change the number when you're done with that one. You do one more time, flips over, you change that number, then you change one more. Oops, see, I went a little bit too far. That one, and then I can change the number, and then when I'm done I can just go ahead and hit this, and I'm all set. So you can see, you know, I pressed it once, it didn't take. I had to press it a little bit harder or a little bit longer the next time to make it take. You know, every once in a while, since I fly VFR a lot, I'm not using the transponder a lot, and I forget sometimes, and so I do something like I change the number, and then I press this to enter it, and I'm like, oh, rats, that didn't work. It sends me back to the beginning because I don't need to press that to enter it. All I need to do is go to the next number with this. This just changes which number when I'm there. So it takes a little practice. If you don't use it very often, and you're going to go into airspace where you're going to have to change the transponder code, then I would definitely suggest that that you do a little practice on the ground. Get used to that before you go. Other than that, it's been a great transponder. Works great. You know, it has a VFR button where no matter what you're on, if you just hit that, it goes back to 1200. It's got some other things that you can set here. It gives you your pressure altitude, flight time, and there's a countdown timer. There's some other things you can do on there. There's your ident button right there. So it's a good setup. I do like it, and it's small. It's not, you know, when you've got a small panel on a Sonex, that's not taking up a lot of real estate. So you can see I put the radios, this one and this one, on the fixed part of my panel, not the removable part of the panel. So I didn't want the radios moving every time I took the center panel out to do some work. And you know, some people have commented that, well, wait a minute, you've got a radio on this side, and way over here on the other side of the cockpit you've got another radio. That's not right in front of you. Well, the cockpit on a Sonex is pretty small, so there is absolutely no reason whatsoever why any of your instruments have to be all on one side. You know, my flight instruments are you know, in the center, just slightly off center from me. Radios there, transponders there. It's all completely viewable and usable. You don't have to stretch and you don't have to strain your eyes to see everything. It works just fine. So you'll notice on my panel I don't have a lot of wires hanging down. So I've got one wire here that's going from my radio to my MP3 player. Other than that, I've got nothing on there. So where are my headsets and where are my auxiliary electrical inputs? So I decided to put my auxiliaries, the 12-volt lighters, up here on top of the glare shield there, and over on the other side there. And then I can plug anything in there that you normally would. And then I have the USB adapter to go in here to plug in any USB items. Now you might ask, where are my headset jacks? They're not there in the panel, so there's nothing hanging down on my legs or anywhere else. There's nothing over here on the side, nothing over here on the side. What I decided to do was put it behind here. So there it is. There's the little box that I had gotten from Aircraft Spruce, and I don't think they make this particular one anymore. But that's where the jacks are. And if you can see the way the jacks are here, they're actually below the level of this, because I figured I was going to be throwing things in and out or reaching my arm back, and I didn't want these sticking way up here where I was going to smack them with my elbow or something else and risk bending them or damaging them. So I had to mount it down as far as I could go, which meant that actually the bottom of this little box is hanging down below that spar right there. But I find that works really well. I haven't really had any issues, and I like it. So you'll notice here, just in front of the stick and just above the flap tube, I have a water bottle holder. That one has a water bottle on it. There's one without, and it's attached to the front of the spar tunnel. And the only way to do that, to get in there to do the rivets and whatever fasteners, because remember the spar goes through there and it's very tight, so you can't have a fastener sticking out into that spar tunnel. So I have a couple of flush rivets holding that in place, but the only way to do that was to install these when the bottom skin was not yet on. So it left the bottom of the spar tunnel open so I could get in there and install those. So these particular ones, you see it has a little knurled knob there in the front, and that allows that cage, that outer cage there, to get adjusted out or in to accommodate bigger or smaller bottles. So I thought that was a nice touch. The first time I installed it, it was before I had gotten the flap tube in, and when I went to put the flap tube in, I realized that I had mounted those water bottle holders too low and couldn't get the flap tube in. So I had to take them out and put them back in up a little bit higher. But I just think this is a fantastic addition to any airplane. You know, it just holds my water bottle right there, holds one for the passenger or an extra one when I'm doing a long cross country. And of course I always joke to people that they're my beer holders and not my water holders. But definitely highly recommended, but again, not something you can do if you've already put the bottom skin on the airplane. So I did want to have a halon fire extinguisher in the cockpit, and the trouble is where to mount it. There's not a lot of room on the sides or on the spar tunnel over here. So I was able to get the bracket to mount on that horizontal tube on the floor, and it's completely out of my way. I've never had it get in the way of my feet or the passengers or anything else. Now, I know some people are like, oh, I'm not going to spray halon in my cockpit because it's going to asphyxiate me. And that's absolutely and utterly untrue. The halon will take out enough oxygen from the air to kill a fire. It will not take enough oxygen out of the air to kill you. So, much rather have the halon in there than some kind of powder or anything else in the aircraft if something goes wrong. So what you see right there is often referred to as a forest of tabs, and it's the ground block. There's an equivalent number of tabs on the other side of the firewall, and of course the fasteners there fasten it to the firewall. So that is the grounding point for everything on the airplane. So I have absolutely no ground wires that are grounded to the airplane itself. Every single ground wire comes back to this ground block, and then the ground block on the firewall side is connected directly to the battery, to the negative side of the battery. So the absolute worst thing you can do on an airplane is to ground things to the airframe. It's convenient, it's done all the time in certified airplanes, but 90% of the electrical problems that you find in an aircraft have to do with grounding issues, and a lot of that is discontinuity, where the ground just isn't getting back properly to the battery, and this really alleviates that. Especially in a Sonex, there's so little wire relatively. You're adding ounces to the airplane, if even that. So it's really worth doing, and that includes even my wingtip lights from way out on the ends of the wings. The ground wire runs all the way through the wing, comes out the wing root down here, goes up and over to the ground block. One thing you may be able to see on there is at the end of every wire there is a piece of clear shrink wrap tubing, and underneath that is a label that was made on a printer and labels exactly what that wire is. So there is absolutely no guessing. Every single one of my wires, whether it be ground or whether it be power or anything else, has a label at both ends. And I just can't see ever building an aircraft without doing that, because otherwise trying to track down the wires is just a total nightmare. Since I have switch breakers and I was running out of positions, I don't normally fly at night, but I wanted to make sure I did have some cockpit lighting. I used to have that on this panel until I added my ADS-B, then I ran out of switches. So what I did is I wired that into my strobe light, and then whenever that's on, it energizes this circuit. So here's my cockpit light. It's adjustable, and it has both red and white lights. And again, it's adjustable, and that circuit goes right here, the little rocker switch. So it's 3 positions. So there is white light, in the middle is off, up there is red light. So normally it's off, and during the daytime, if I don't have my lights on, then that wouldn't even be energized. When I shut down the airplane, that shuts off, so there's no danger of accidentally leaving that on after I shut everything down. But I like that. Seems to work well. This gives me plenty of light over my shoulder, and again, I can direct it wherever I need to. And it just runs straight off the 12-volt system without having any ballast or other electrical device in between to convert the power. So here's the baggage sling I made out of the same fabric as my front seats. It's a Cordura fabric, and it's on with Velcro up there and back there and the sides, and Velcro right here also. And if you don't put any kind of a frame on it, then when you put something in it, it really just kind of presses down in the middle and makes a big sag. So I just made a very lightweight aluminum frame, and it's all held together with little duct tape, with little Velcro tabs. And to get it in and out, this whole frame doesn't fit inside of this opening. So that right there is a joint, and right over here is a joint. So I epoxied in a little piece of metal on one side, so it's fixed on one side and it slides into the tube on the other. So I can just take these here and pull them apart. You can see that right there. You get this out and then put it back together. It holds the frame in place, and this comes out pretty quickly with the Velcro if I want to put big stuff underneath when I'm doing a longer trip. So I think as a control lock, most people take the seat belt, pull the stick all the way back, put the seat belt around it. But the problem I found with that is that doing that holds the elevator up. And when you live in New England, like I do, and you get snow, in the wintertime all that snow piles up right in here and sits right there in the hinge line. So I'd rather have the tail down when the controls are locked, let the snow and the ice run. So my control lock is about a 2-foot long piece of strapping with the lock that locks in there. So what I do is I take that strap and I put one end going around the stick this way, and the other end I put underneath the flap tube. I even wrap it around once just to keep it a little bit tighter. And then I come up here and I snap like that, and then I just pull that tight, and that holds the stick right there, holds it forward instead of backward. During the winter, the vast majority of air that comes into the cockpit is not around the canopy. It's through the wing roots of the airplane. So you've got the opening here where the stick controls go into the wing, and then you've got the opening down there where you've got the flap assembly and the rest of the opening at the root of the wing. Tremendous amounts of air come in there. And I tried making a boot here, sort of like a boot for the control stick, that has Velcro on the fuselage and has this fake leather, and then it's got the end of this here, the witch's hat look, has some Velcro. My implementation of it hasn't really worked very well. There's still a lot of air that comes in around that. So, but you have to make sure that you've got the full movement of the stick and the push rods in and out, back and forth. So it's got to be something like a witch's hat or something that's very flexible. You can't put anything in there that's rigid. Up here, you can see that I put some Velcro around that opening and was trying to make a cover to go over there as well. And again, I just never really got to finishing it, and it didn't seem like it was all that effective when I was trying it with the boot. Trying to make boots or covers that work, in any of these openings, really, really, really tough. You wouldn't think so, but it's really, really tough after the fact. So if you're going to try to do this, do it before you put the wings on the airplane. That way you'll have everything off. You've got plenty of room, lots of measurement. You can put Velcro. You know, it's just much easier. So if you're going to try something, I would do it before you put your wings on. So in the wintertime, what I actually do, and it actually works fairly well, is I've got a small towel that I just stuff in here between the seat and the side of the aircraft, and just short of the flap assembly here. And I do that on both sides of the cockpit, and that keeps most of the air off of my legs. And that's really the worst part when the air is getting in, is it blowing right in your legs. Other than that, it's just my feet that get cold, and you would think that that wouldn't happen because your feet are up by the firewall, but that seems to be the cold spot regardless. So I do dress warmly in the winter because we really don't have much workable heat here off of VW, but you know, putting these towels in here does help quite a bit. So installing the windscreen, which is on a solid bow, I went ahead and did what the plan said, and I just tapped the bows. Usually you put those fasteners in once and you're done. You're not going to tend to strip them. But the canopy, on the other hand, that's a different story. So on this one, especially when you're mounting the canopy, you're taking it on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. And these tubes are hollow. So that means if you drill and tap, you're only drill and tapping a very narrow wall of tubing here, and sooner or later you're going to strip it, or maybe even worse, while you're putting the canopy on and off, you strip it. So I did what some other people have done, and I went ahead and used a nut on the other side. So I drilled all the way through the tube, put a nut on. That allowed me also to use various thickness of washers there in between the canopy and the bow, so that when I close the canopy, I could use those washers to adjust where the canopy material went to try to get it flush with the edge of the turtle deck here. So I've never regretted doing that, and in fact this is my second canopy because I broke one coming back from Oshkosh one year, had to replace it, and so much easier to just undo everything this way, replace it, put it back together. And again, the on-off, on-off, on-off that you're doing when you're first putting a canopy on means that you're taking these fasteners in and out, in and out, in and out, and sooner or later you run the risk of stripping the tubing here. So one thing I did with my canopy, because the canopy really is the flimsiest part of the aircraft, and it really gets tossed around when you throw it open and close it, and especially if there's a little wind, is normally in the Sonex plans you only have this cross piece right here going to the bows. I went ahead and added an angle in here, just another piece of tube, another angle in here with a gusset, and just a gusset on one side. And that really does help stiffen things up, and it doesn't get in the way of the baggage compartment or anything else. So I really like that as an option and recommend it. So maybe you can see here by using the washers, I was able to get the canopy material to always be flush with the turtle deck. And some people get concerned about the gap between the canopy and the turtle deck, about water and air getting in. Well, the Sonex, it does leak like a sieve, so not really much way around that. And it's really not made for flying through rain and bad weather anyway. But one thing that it does not do, it does not let a whole bunch of air in there. So when you're flying along in the winter, you put your hand here from inside and you feel no air coming in there. It really just flows over the top. If anything, it pulls air out from negative pressure. And you really need that gap in there. If you try to make that too tight to the turtle deck in the summertime in the warm weather, when this material expands, it's going to push against the turtle deck, and it's going to start to buckle. And anytime you have buckling pressure like that, you run the risk of cracking. One thing I wish I had done was to put sealant in between the windscreen and the bow underneath that these fasteners fasten to, because some air, but more importantly water, if you ever fly through a little light rain, does get underneath that in between here and start to run across the windscreen and down the sides right here, and that water comes all the way back to the cockpit. So if you get the opportunity, put just a very small bead of clear silicone sealant in there, and you'd be a lot happier. So there's actually a lot of air at the front windscreen that comes in between the windscreen and the edge of the canopy. And it's really difficult on the Sonex to get that closed up. You could try to put some flat tape weather stripping in there, but anything of any thickness really impedes closing the canopy cleanly all the way across. So what I've used is this V-shaped insulation. I had to cut it because it's on a curve and it won't bend cleanly, so I just made some snips every 4 inches or so. And the V, that's the bottom of the V, and this top flap is facing forward, not backward, because if any air gets in there in between, the air forces it up tighter against the bottom edge of the canopy. So the faster you fly, or the more air that goes in there, the more it seals it up. If you faced it backward, it wouldn't do any good whatsoever. The air would just go right past it. So I've got that all the way from the bottom here, and that's just, that white is just the canopy kind of rubbing off on a little bit over time. And it goes all the way up and over to the other side. And I have found that that cuts down tremendously on the amount of air that gets in the front edge of the canopy. So the latch assembly on the Sonex plans are just have one notch up here in the top. They don't have any of this extended stuff down here below on either side. And what some people decided to do was get a bigger angle. That's actually a little difficult to find, an angle that's that big. But a bigger angle and put the notch up here, but also add another notch down here. And the reason being, if you want to have some airflow into the aircraft when you're taxiing, although I don't do that, it just seems like more effort than it's worth, and can blow the canopy around. But especially when you're parked and it's a hot day and you want to have some airflow in the airplane, then you've got this lower notch that fits in here and holds the canopy open in here. And then when you're not using that, pull the latch all the way back, and it goes all the way down and locks into place. When I first built the canopy, I went ahead and put in the spring that's on the plans that goes from this little tab forward, and it's supposed to be to keep the latch assembly from accidentally going backward, to help it keep forward. Just never really found a great need for it. You got to have a latch pin anyway, and it just wasn't really doing anything for me, so I went ahead and took off the spring. What I do have here, instead of what Sonex is showing for a cotter pin, is I have this latch pin assembly here that goes in here. This has a couple of pins that stick out on either side. If you can see those, they're very small. And they extend out or retract by pushing this blue button in. So when I want to put this pin in there to lock the canopy, canopy's all the way forward, push the blue button, put that in, make sure the blue button's out, and now this is locked in place and it isn't going to come out in flight. And I used to have a little piece of fishing line that went from here to the handle, so it would stay with the aircraft even when I opened the canopy. But what I found is when I opened the canopy and this thing was swinging from that line here, it was banging the canopy and going around in the wind. So I just took it off, and what I did is I just have a hole here in this gusset for the instrument panel, and when I'm not using it, I just put it in there. When I am using it, I take it out, I put it in there, and that keeps the canopy locked. So another thing I had to do after the fact with my canopy was, after 3 years or so of use, this pin right here that was only threaded into the aluminum of the canopy piece here finally just worked its way loose, and I couldn't get it to stay back in, so I could have put in a larger that is made from a little screw. I could have used a wider screw and made this hole bigger, but it just seemed like that was going to keep happening over and over again over the years. So what I did is I took this whole frame assembly apart, and I made a square piece of aluminum that fit just inside of that square tube, and I tapped it, I pre-tapped it ahead of time, and I let it slide back here, and I kind of moved it back and forth until I could get this pin to screw into the threads that I had created there, and then I went ahead and epoxied that in place also. So now I've got, you know, this much aluminum that this is tapped into, whereas before it was just a very thin wall of aluminum here. This thing will wear out if you don't do something like that. And the problem is, if this pin doesn't engage this whole mechanism doesn't work, because it allows the entire canopy to move when you try to move these handles. This pin holds the canopy against that location and lets this slide back and forth. So this is an extremely important pin, and it has to not move. So I'm using a marine grade lock assembly for locking up the aircraft, rather than what the Sonex plans show for a padlock on the canopy latch. So right now this is in the unlocked position with this back here. When I'm outside and I rotate the key counterclockwise, this rotates up and comes to the back of this and keeps this from being able to go back and open up the latch for the canopy. So I did have to modify this a little bit. You know, it just came here and bent that way. I had to rivet on a little tab here that stuck out a little bit further, so that when I rotated up it was actually making contact with the back of this here. The standard Sonex tail wheel is a 4-inch diameter. This one happens to be a 6-inch diameter from Van's Aircraft, and I consider 6 inches an absolute must. The 4 inches is too small to span across cracks in pavement and runways, and this bolt right here that holds the assembly together is very close to the ground, even with a 6-inch tail wheel, and is all scraped up here because as the wheel goes through divots in the ground, this gets low enough to actually hit the ground and get scraped. With a 4-inch tail wheel, that's happening way more often. So a 6-inch tail wheel to me is a must. So the other thing I've done here with my tail wheel assembly is, instead of having a push rod that just pivots here and back here and tends to oval out over time, I instead put rod end bearings at either side, at either end, so that the point inside the aluminum here and inside of this piece of steel is always completely fixed tight. It doesn't rotate in there. You're not going to get wallowing of the hole. And then, but you've still got a really nice pivot point here. Now, if you just took a straight line from here to here, this ball joint ends up being at a really odd angle. And so what I ended up doing was coming up with a compound bend here in that push rod to try to get that evened out, so this isn't quite at such an angle. Up here is pretty flat as it is. These are the Sonex disc brakes. Here's the valve body. Gets the fluid from the brake handle through here. Bleeder valve there. And you've got the friction pad back here, and then there's two pads inside this body that look like little hockey pucks. And when you activate the brake, those two hockey pucks push against here, and that's what stops the aircraft. So I'm pretty happy with these. I've never had any issues putting them on. The instructions didn't seem to match all of the parts that I had, so I did have to do a little bit of my own work here with this attachment. But other than that, I got everything on just fine. To be able to get the wheel pant on and off around the plumbing on the back of the brake assembly, I did have to enlarge this and cut a little notch back there that the hose goes through when I'm sliding the wheel pant on. So I did have to do some modifications that were not specifically shown or scaled. Just had to do a little trial and error until I got something that fit. I reinforced all of the areas where the screws go through the wheel pants. The outside here. If I didn't, then it was just going to start cracking up the fiberglass, and eventually I would get cracks that would come out to the edge here. So essentially what I did was, you know, I can see down here there's a square of aluminum that I put in there and fiberglassed it in. And I did the same thing on this side, where I have some aluminum that I fiberglassed in, and then put the holes through that. And never had any issues in the last 5 years with anything cracking. And I think that's something you really need to do, is make sure you reinforce around those holes in some way or shape or form. One thing I did find late in the game was that the distance from the outside of the published distance from the axle to the back of the wheel pant housing is wider than the opening of the wheel pant. And so what ends up happening is, when I put this wheel pant on here, the wheel pant itself is bulging outward to fit over this. So if I'd known that in advance, I would have cut at least a 1/4 inch off of this bolt, so that it would have been in a little bit closer and a little bit closer to the inside width of the wheel pant without having to bulge out. Here's the difference in width. If you look at how much of that bolt is sticking out beyond the face of the wheel pant, you can see it's quite a bit longer than it needs to be. Here's essentially how the wheel pant slides on. So that little notch lines up with the tubing, and then that slides forward, and then the holes line up. So for the gear leg fairings, Sonex shows the pin at the back of the fairings coming from inside the fuselage, going all the way down here to the bottom. Me and a lot of other people didn't really like that too much, and so what we actually did was we took the hinge pins and split them so that one goes up, one goes down. They start from this notch right here. And what I have here that you can't see, I'll try to put a picture in here, is there's a couple of addle clamps that are clamped onto the leg, and this fairing then clips onto or bolts into that addle clamp, and that's what keeps this from sliding up and down. And it has a little bit of room to wiggle back and forth, but not a lot. I tried some attachments up here where it attached to the bottom of the fuselage, but there was just way too much movement in here, and the hinge shaft that I had in there trying to hold that in place kept breaking, and it just wasn't a good solution because of all the flexing happening up here. So this works just fine. Everything's attached here in the midpoint. This is free to move. Everything down here is free to move. So down there is the hydraulic cylinder for the Sonex hydraulic brakes, and here's the little actuator arm, and here's the brake handle. Now what many people did with the original Sonex brakes, and I wanted to be able to do with this, was to be able to use this as an emergency brake by sliding it back and putting it into the first notch of the flaps, thereby pulling back the lever and holding the brakes. And then when you're not using that, you just let it go. Well, if you look down here, the angle of the actuator is pointing way off over here. So if I put the brake handle, coming off of that way up here, it was never going to get back to the notch. So I built a solid handle. I kind of measured the angle that I needed. I built a solid handle that came up and back. But what I found is that I either had not enough angle or too much angle, and I wasn't getting what I needed. So I would get the handle into the notch, and I would find out it was either not enough pull on the lever to hold the brakes, or I was finding that it needed to come back further than I had angle for on there. So rather than making a frustratingly large number of handles until I got it right, what I ended up doing was putting the two bolts in here, but one of those, what you can't see, is I wallowed the hole a little bit left and right, made it just a little bit longer so it's not actually round. And what that allowed me to do is it allowed me to move this handle fractions of an inch, which is all you needed, because a fraction of an inch down here translates into a lot more distance up here. So once I got that to where it needed to be, then I just tightened these down really tight. The first one was just a pivot point, so that it was round, and then the second one was the elongated hole, and that's the one that really needs to be tight so that it doesn't slide around. So it's something that I check every year on my annual condition inspection, and I haven't had it slide out, but if I ever did, I could loosen it up a little bit, push the handle back to where it needed to be, tighten that down, and I'd be good to go again. So rather than having two bolts that hold the wing in place through the wing attach blocks, Sonex actually uses, and will recommend if you ask them, using a trailer hitch pin. So right there, it's available from McMaster Car. I'll put a little information on this video about the model number and where to find it, but essentially it goes through the wing spar here. It's got a little piece there in the end that's got a little cable attached to it, so I just took the end of that cable and riveted it down below where you can't see it, and that's just so if I ever do take the pins out, they'll just stay with the airplane. They're not floating around and I don't lose them. Sonex says there's not actually that much force being put on the pins. The trailer hitch pins are way more strong than they need to be to do this job, so there's no issues there. Maybe hard to see, but you can just see the tip of the trailer pin sticking out right here, right down past my finger, and then you see the cotter pin that's through it. So that's the pointy end of the trailer pin. So another thing that I added from the Sonex plans was at the root of the flap, I still have the piece of flat angle that's underneath here that helps keep the flap from riding up. But I also added this fairing on here. I did some tests with some cardboard, and then after that with some metal, and came up with the final shape, and it's just riveted up here, and the flap just goes to the underside of this. And what I had done through some testing was I put a camera out on the end of the wing here, facing in, and I put, with some tape and some yarn, I put a lot of tufted yarn up here and along here to see what the air was doing. And just like I had surmised, this break in the fuselage and this intersection with the flap creates a lot of turbulence, and you could just see that yarn flying all over the place when I was flying. So then I made the fairing, put it on with painter's tape, and it held just fine, and did some tests with the camera again, and found out that all that airflow smoothed out going across here at the wing root. So I don't know if I can quantify that it's helped with stall or it's helped with air speeds, but it certainly helped in an empirical way on the video. So I went ahead and added that in, and I did some testing with my stall, and I did not notice any detriment to the stall buffet. I still got the stall buffet at the same time that I always did before that. So don't know if it helps, but it certainly can't hurt. So for experimental aircraft, you're required to have some large letters saying experimental if you're able to take a passenger in the aircraft, and it's got to be somewhere visible when the passenger is getting into the aircraft. So I saw this trick on some other person's airplane years ago and liked it, so I did the same thing. So I've got my wing walk tape here, and I've got several stripes of that, but then the actual letters of experimental are made of the same wing walk material. And the way I did that was I just got the font that I liked on my computer and the size I wanted, and printed it out on a piece of paper, and then put it on the wing walk material and cut it out with a sharp X-Acto knife, and then peeled it off and put it on the aircraft. And that's been on there now for 5 years, and nothing's come off, and it's a great way to do that. So I opted for a combination strobe and position light, wingtip lights on both sides. So the strobe's a little overwhelming on there, so I'll turn that off here in a second, but they're all LEDs so they don't draw a whole lot of power. I don't know how well the camera's picking that up, but there's the red light here and the white light back here. And here's the green and white light over on this side. So these lights are mounted on a fiberglass pod that's then screwed to the end of the wingtip. If I ever need to maintain or replace anything, I can just take those 4 screws out, take this off, and get to all the wiring. And per FAA regulations, if you're going to fly at night, these need to be viewable from various angles, including angles up above and down below. And on a Sonex with this angled wingtip, it's tough to get this in the right location to be viewable from above. So you want to get a pod that's far enough out, maybe even further than this one, in order to be able to get that out far enough to meet the regulations. You don't have to have these lights in the daytime. They're just for visibility, so you don't have to comply with anything in the daytime. But obviously, if you're complying with the FAA regs, then you're probably just that much better, that much safer for visibility. And here I have a Duckworks landing light. This is an older version. It was an HID lamp, which again doesn't really have a filament that's going to burn out on you. I've had this one for 5 years with no problems, but you know, nowadays most of the lights that you're going to get are LEDs and are going to be just as bright, if not brighter. I don't generally fly at night these days, but one thing that I would have done differently is I would have put my landing light on the left wing instead of the right wing. Reason being, when I'm taxiing at night, or if I was flying, landing, you're on the left side of the aircraft. And so you're looking down the left side of the aircraft and the left side of the runway. Well, with the landing light on the right side of the runway, you're not seeing much, if anything, over here. So it would have been much better to put the landing light on the left side so I'd actually see the edge of the runway lit up with the light, rather than having to kind of crane my neck off to the right side to try to see what the landing light was illuminating over there. So I horizontally split my cowl. Before that was an option at Sonex. It was the vertical split, so I fiberglassed that up and made the horizontal, and just decided, instead of some of the other fasteners, everything else on a Sonex is done with a hinge pin, hinge and a hinge pin, so I did the same thing here. So I've got one half of the hinge on the lower cowl, one half on the upper cowl, and then I've got the hinge pin here, which just, you grab that, pull that, slides all the way out. Do that on both sides, and take the top cowl off. So the only fasteners I have is there's one up here and one on the other side. So there's a little fiberglass tab that comes down from the top here, it grabs that fastener. But other than that, and then back here at the back, I used floating nut plates on the stainless steel band that's underneath here. That way I didn't have to get the holes exactly aligned, just close. And then I used the fasteners here to hold the back of the cowl on. So to take the cowl off, I pull the 2 fasteners in the front, pull the 2 hinge pins, the 6 screws, this comes off, and really that takes less than 2 minutes. And then to put it back on takes about 2 minutes to put all that stuff on. So not a big deal, works great. So to attach the cowl back here at the windscreen, I decided to use nut plates, floating nut plates. So if I put my finger in the back side here, you might see that the threaded portion moves around. And that's so that I didn't have to have this hole exactly lined up with those threads. It gives it a little leeway for back and forth. Works great, highly recommended. If this thing ever strips out, all I do is take out those 2 rivets and put in a new nut plate, and I'm all set to go. So there's the screw with the Tinnerman washer going through the hole, and I've got a little latitude because of the floating nut plate for this to move around a little bit and doesn't accidentally strip the threads. What I have found is that at my annual condition inspection every year, I replace all 6 of these fasteners because going on, off all the time, they do start to wear out right at the point where they go into the threads of the floating nut plate, and they'll start to spin on you. And if you take the screws out and look at the threads, you'll see it's actually the threads on the screws, not the threads in the floating nut plates. So as a matter of course, I just replace these every year during my annual condition inspection. I was never able to get my K&N air filter, the tall one, to fit fully within the cowl. So I finally just went ahead and made a little blister for the air filter. And you can see that just bumps out a little bit here. The air just flows around it. Not any big deal at all, but it gives a lot more clearance, a lot more airflow around the filter. So if you do the fuel door per the Sonex plans, there's a few issues, not the least of which is the way this is configured, that any water that gets in here, air that gets in here, fuel that spills, goes right into the cockpit. Not a good idea. This happens to be my fuel vent. It actually vents from down underneath the cowl, at the bottom of the cowl, comes up via a tube, and here it goes up and then back down and then into the tank. And the reason for the up and down is to make sure that this is well above the level of the tank, and that means that on a tail dragger I can go ahead and put in a full 17 gallons instead of 16 gallons. Then I went ahead and put the hinge here, and I've got this little fastener here that I just give a quarter turn to, open this up, and I've got my fuel filler. I've got one of the spin-on fuel filler caps, which I absolutely love, and I had it engraved with the required markings. You'll notice in here I have a pan that I built. It's on my kit log site. It's continuous and it's sealed here, and then it has a hole right there that goes to an overflow tube. So any water or fuel that spills in here, none of it goes back into the cockpit. It all comes down here to the low point, goes in that tube, and it comes out the bottom over here. And again, you'll see this is my vent. So it's fastened to the top of the tank here. And it goes up, turns down, makes a little turn, and it's got a little piece of flexible tubing there that then goes to another piece of rigid aluminum tubing, and that's the thing that goes down and vents out the bottom of the cowl. And this closes easily, just right around that. And yeah, water can get in there, but so what? It's got a place to go and it drains down, so it's not going in the cockpit. So I've never found this, not tight closure to be an issue. I was meant to paint this red and I just never got around to it. So per the Sonex plans, I put on the oil filler cover, and basically I've never used it. The top of this comes off so easily that it was easier just to pull the top off, check the oil, put new oil in. And in fact, what I find is that the oil dipstick right there is so difficult to get out of here when you're checking the dipstick that it just scrapes the oil right off the dipstick and pretty much makes checking the oil from this front useless. And since I didn't put a door up here to pull it out, to check the oil I just take the top off, check the oil. If I need to put anything in, I fill it. So I would say you don't need this, or if you're going to have that, then put one over here too so that you can get to the dipstick vertically, not try to pull it out horizontally. So if you have the top mounted oil cooler, then the opening that Sonex has down here to let air into the bottom mounted oil cooler is way bigger than it needs to be. What I found is that it over pressurizes the inside of the cowling and doesn't let the air going through here and coming out the back properly expand and escape. It's over pressurizing the inside. So Sonex still recommends that some air goes underneath the oil sump plate to help keep that cool. So in the summertime, I just put on a plate here that covers the entire hole, other than this small hole that I have here that lets some air in to let some cooling air underneath the engine block. But other than that, I've got the whole thing blanked off. And in the winter time, this is a solid plate. I don't have one with a hole in it, and because it's just too cold in the winter to worry about needing to cool any of the engine down. So when I was having trouble with my engine getting too hot, several things I did, one of which was to decrease the size of the oil cooler inlet, and the other thing was to increase the size of the outlet. So this is the size of the outlet here that Sonex recommended, with a plate here to go ahead and deflect air and create a negative pressure area. But I was finding that wasn't enough, and so I needed to make this bigger, but I didn't just want to make it bigger and then find out that I had the wrong size, so I did some testing by putting a little hinge half, or a little piece of a hinge half in here and over on the other side, which just holds the bottom of the cowl off. You know, usually it's flush with the bottom of the fuselage here, but this holds it off, so that I've basically got another several square inches of opening here and on both sides, and that seemed to help quite a bit. And I just haven't gotten around to actually putting that back where it belongs and making this bigger. I've just kind of left it like this, and someday I may get around to it, but the big point is that no matter how you do it, it seems to me, or I've found anyway with my VW, that I did need more square inches of outlet for the air. So the plugs in my cowl are just made from 1 inch thick rigid insulation that you buy at any Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards, and just cut it roughly to size, and then use a rough file, and that's the easiest way to cut it down to its final size. I tried cutting it with other sharp objects, and it really just makes this material just kind of ball up and fall off. So found it was much cleaner using a file. But if I ever lose one, I just make another one. It cost me a few pennies, no big deal. So this is the input for my charging port. I just pull that out, and then I can plug the battery charger right in there, and it's connected on the inside to the battery. Here's the receptacle on the bottom of the cowl. Right now the cowl's turned upside down, so this would normally be on the bottom. But again, there's the male-female. So the battery charger has the same male-female connectors on the end, so all I do is plug that in here, and the cowl is on, remember, and everything's connected. And just turn on the battery charger, and that keeps everything charged. Is that here's the other side, so it's another connector, you know, opposite male-female, and comes down to a little receptacle down here, which I'll show you in a second. But again, you can see when I take the cowl on and off, I need some way to disconnect the wires, so that's what that's for. So when I put the cowl on, I just reach down and connect that together. So let's see if I can explain this little thing, this little fitting here, which you may be familiar with from motorcycle batteries and other things like that. But so there's a positive and a negative. The wires go up here and split. So one of these, if you can see, the negative one goes up to my grounding block. Okay, so that goes to ground. The other wire comes up here, goes to a fuse, just to protect the circuit. And then it goes from there to the, so you can see it down there, it goes to the positive side, the post side of my master contactor. And then that's the black wire down there. And then the red wire comes up here, if you can see, and goes right up here to the positive terminal. So if you can see, the cowl's back on, and I've got the connector between the cowl and the wire going to the battery all connected up, and it all comes down here to to that receptacle we looked at. So when I did the baffling on my cowl, I used the stuff that Sonex recommended. That's the stuff that's shaped like a pea. But what I found was it was very, very difficult to get just the right height on all of this stuff, to make contact with the cowl, to not be too high and bow up the cowl, to not be too low and let air through. When I did my top-mounted oil cooler, I went ahead and used the straight material. So that's this stuff here, the straight baffle material, and was able to rivet here, and all the excess can just get folded over. There's a little bit of lacing cord there to hold those corners together, to make sure that everything, when the cowl goes on, compresses down this way and it doesn't flop out in the wrong direction. So if I were going to do this over again, I'd have used the straight material here instead of the pea-shaped material, because again, that material can come up. It can be much longer than it needs to be here and here. You can fold it over this way, fold it over this way, use some of the lacing cords in the corner just to make sure that it stays folded in this direction and not the other direction. And that would have been just a whole lot easier to work with and get a tight seal without having to do the on-off, on-off, on-off constantly of the cowl, and then hoping that you still got this right. In fact, this piece of heat tape right here is because there was just a little bit of a gap from here to here, between here and the cowl, and I didn't really want to do this baffling all over again, so I just stuck some heat tape on there. It folds forward and the cowl sits against that, and you can see here the wear pattern over the years. So when the air comes in here, it just pushes this up against the cowl and doesn't let the air out. And that's the same thing that the straight baffle material would do. It would sit here like this. Any air that came in there would try to push it up, but it would just push up against the bottom of the cowl. So underneath here, what you can't see is first the fire sleeve, and then some of this black insulation, the same stuff you use to put around your pipes, your hot pipes at home. And then I have the heat tape around that, and this happens to be what I'm using. And I just wrap the whole thing up all the way from the carb all the way to the firewall, and that includes going around my gold cube fuel sender. And I have never ever had a hiccup on the engine due to heat or vapor lock. So the downside to the way I have my fuel system insulated is that every year when I do my annual condition inspection like now, I have to take all this insulation off to be able to check this inline filter. If I didn't mention it before, you'll see that there is no gas collator in this system. Sonex says you don't really need it, and over the years I've definitely concurred. Such a short run, the bottom of the fuel tank's just on the other side of the firewall, and then you've got this short run here to the carburetor. So if there's any water that's in the tank, all that water is going to come out when you first turn on the fuel, and it's either going to come out just when you turn on the fuel, or when you go to start the engine, it's going to cough and sputter, and then it's going to finally catch when you get fuel and no water. It's just such a short distance. You're not going to have something like a high-wing Cessna where you've got fuel up in the wing, and it's going to take a long time for it to get from the wing through the fuel system to the carburetor, possibly right when you're taking off. Here, by the time you ever throttle up to taxi, any water that might have been in there is gone. Well, stupid me, I went and closed all this up before pointing out and talking about a few things in the fuel system. So what you don't see in here is what I talked about, the braided hose, the AN6 fittings. That's what the entire thing is, and then wrapped in the fire sleeve. And then up here you saw when the wrap was off that I had the gold cube fuel sender, and most people that have Sonexes have the red cube. When I read the website, this kind of a gravity feed system, they were talking about using a gold cube. So I contacted the company and they said, no, for a Sonex you should definitely use the gold cube and not the red cube. But I've never had totally accurate readings with the gold cube. Sometimes when I know it's burning, 4.5 gallons an hour, it's telling me I'm at 7. I look back down 10 minutes later and it says it's at, 4 point something. It's just not as accurate as I would have hoped for a fuel sender, but I did find when I first installed it that I had the fuel filter first and then the gold cube, and it was wildly off. So I switched the two, put the gold cube first and then the filter, and that definitely made things better, but it's still, not as great as I had hoped it was going to be. So I started out with the Sonex ground adjustable prop and just was not in the slightest bit happy with that. It was way underperforming. I could never get an adjustment fine enough to make the RPMs work the way they should. I unfortunately had a prop strike some years ago, replaced the prop, and I went and got the Sonex wood prop with the fiberglass wrap, and performance was better. It was a fixed pitch, but still never felt like I was getting what I needed out of it. So I finally went and got a Prince P-tip composite prop, and really like this prop. Altogether, my climb is better, my cruise is better. Really enjoy it. Lonnie Prince is great to work with, and the P-tip, if you can see that here, has a bend in it that's designed that way. The funny thing is, every once in a while somebody will look at the prop and say, hey, you had a prop strike, because look, your tips are bent. But it guaranteed it is supposed to be that way. So very happy with that prop. So you'll notice my aircraft is polished, and that's not just because it looks cool, although it does. But if you paint the entire aircraft, other people have weighed the airplane before and after, and it adds about 25 pounds to the airframe, believe it or not. And when you've got an Aero-V that's only got 80 horsepower, and you want to have the ability to carry gas and people and things, saving every pound is pretty important. So I decided I was going to polish rather than paint. And I had this sitting outside at tie downs for nearly 5 years, and it did just fine. I had a canopy cover on it, and I had wing covers, but no corrosion. Everything is still great. You do have to polish it every once in a while. So last year I did spend some time polishing the wings, which look great now, but fuselage it hasn't been polished since the day it was in my basement, and it still looks pretty good, but it definitely needs a little bit more polishing, so we'll work on that this year. So if you look at all this cracking of my paint, especially down here, you see all those white lines. That's actually not the paint. That's actually the clear coat on top of the paint. So what I found is that that clear coat is just not worth putting on. I'd rather put on a couple of extra layers of paint because it's the clear coat that cracks, and it's even worse whenever it's subjected to heat, like here at the cowl. The other painted areas, like my wheel pants and my tail tips back there, they don't have all this cracking on them. Where the cowl is, certainly does. But even in the tail tips where I don't have the cracking, if I ever scrape the paint like I have before, it's really difficult to patch the paint when you've got the clear coat on there. So I would recommend not putting a clear coat, and if you're worried about the paint, just put an extra 2 coats of paint on. It's going to weigh the same as the couple of layers of clear coat, but you're not going to have that problem with the cracking and grazing. So this is my toolkit when I travel away from home, and I only half-jokingly say that I can just about rebuild the engine with everything in this toolkit. The VW engine is very simple. It doesn't take a lot. Some parts you can get from the local auto parts store for a Volkswagen engine, but mostly you just need some of the tools and bolts and screws and washers and a couple of other special things. So there I have some extra fuses, spark plugs. This is my cheat sheet that gives me all the specs on the engine for torque values, spark plug gaps, those kinds of things. I have the Aero-V and the Aero Injector PDF manuals on my smartphone. There is various sealants. And over here are various tapes, rescue tapes, and heat tape, black electrical tape. And here I've got a whole bunch of various hardware. Don't need a lot of each, but you know, there's various screws and bolts and nuts, some machine screws, washers of different sizes, cotter pins, some other screws. Here I've got a bunch of, you can see those, I've got a bunch of pliers of different types, wire cutters. They're just in the plastic bag, so they're not floating around in the bag. Then I've got various Allen wrenches. I have a torque wrench. Then I have a small ratchet set, both in SAE and metric. And in that bottle, I actually have extra brake fluid. Here I have some safety wire. There I have some various other sockets that don't fit into that set that I need. And over here, that's the spark plug gapping tool, little flashlight, and various small wrenches, pliers, various other wrenches, some different screwdrivers, including one with a very small tip for some of the electrical connections. Then just an extra permanent marker. This is my spark plug tool, and some then tire pressure gauge. I don't travel with this all the time, but when I'm traveling longer distances, I actually have an extra magneto for the primary ignition. I have a rear oil seal. If I ever have to open the crankcase, fix something, put it back together, that's something that you generally won't find at the local auto parts store. So I like to carry one with me. And then I've got actually a couple of extra voltage regulators. Really only need one. I tossed two of them in there. This is an extra length of throttle cable wire, and some various zip ties. And that kind of rounds everything out. So here's my electrical diagram. It's been modified over time as things got changed around or added. But one thing you might notice is there's not a lot of industry symbology on here. So if you compared this to an electrical diagram from the POH of a certified aircraft, you'll find a lot of rectangles and circles on mine as compared to all the proper symbology in the other electrical diagrams. I'm not an electrical engineer, and I just found it easier to read and understand if I just put the names of things into rectangles and circles and showed where the wires went. About the only thing in here that has industry symbology is grounds and light bulbs. Other than that, everything is pretty much a rectangle with a name in it. So I've got the EFIS and the radio and the transponder, the battery, alternator, top trigger, top mag, master contactor, etc. And it's just so much easier to read that way. If I've got any issues, I can go through it and figure out what goes where without having to try to scratch my head and remember what that electrical symbol means. And so don't be afraid to just do something that's simple, readable for you. And believe me, anybody who's an electrical engineer would still be able to understand and follow this, because it's still all in black and white.